Relations, it's a single best combination for me. Let's talk about the deep end and this ocean. Hey, what's your favorite crustacean? We can go on and on until we fall asleep. 'Cause this is how things start. A thunderbolt through the heart. When we do what we do, I wanna whisper to you and the whole world shouts. Find out things that you're about. It won't be hard. It won't be hard if you would like to start. I tell you I like going in exploration, recounting scenes and animation. How we wish our aspirations would go away. Let's talk about all our strange fascinations, our what we hate, our admiration for aliens and languages and things. Oh, but this is how things start. A thunderbolt through the heart. When we do what we do, I wanna whisper to you and the whole world shouts. Find out things that you're about. It won't be hard. It won't be hard if you would like to start. Now I would like to go where our feet can go. Only would know the way. When we start our plans, let me take your hands, and we'll make something that rhymes with adventure. Are you down to start one big adventure with me? With me. I tell you I like breaking your concentration just to say out loud my speculation about the world.
Okay, my mic was on mute. Hello again. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. And for those who are watching the live stream, thank you. You can place your comments in the chat box. I'm Daryll Delgado. I'm the author of the novel Remains. And but today I will be joined by two writers I have very deep admiration for. I'm very, very honored to be part of this panel or this conversation. So you are tuning into an online talk titled A Novel Conversation, Aesthetics and Disaster Politics. So this is organized by the Ateneo University Press as part of the Manila International Online Book Fair. So I'm joined today by two writers and two thinkers. I like to call them, that I have a really deep admiration for, as I keep saying. Professor Caroline Hau from the Center of Southeast Asian Studies at Kyoto University. Ms. Hau was born and raised in Manila. She went to the University of the Philippines, Siliman, and Cornell University. She's also the author of the books Necessary Fictions, Flipping Literature and the Nation, and the Chinese Question, Ethnicity, Nation, and Region in and beyond the Philippines, Elites and Stratas in Philippine Culture, and Interpreting Rizal. She also authored two story collections, Recuerdos de Patay and Other Stories, and Demigods and Monsters. And Tiempo Muerto is her first novel. With us today is also another writer and a journalist, Ms. Criselda Yabes, whose latest novel is Broken Islands. Aside from Broken Islands, she also wrote Below the Crying Mountain, which won the UP Centennial Literary Award in 2008 and was nominated for the Man Asian Literary Prize in 2010. a new edition of this novel is coming out this year from Penguin Southeast Asia. So welcome, Chris and Carol, and welcome to everyone who is tuned in to this online talk. Thank you. Before we start the conversation, I just want to let everyone know that you can check out ManilaBookFair.com for the novels that we will be featuring in this conversation. So those are Remains, Tiempo Muerto, and Broken Habits. Right? Okay, so thank you, Chris and Carol. Kumusta?
Okay,
You
thank you.
okay?
Good,
All
yes.
right.
Yeah, woke
Yeah.
up for this.
Woke up early. Yeah. So it's unfortunate that we have to do this online. This is like a almost like a dream come true for me. If I had a fantasy dinner, and I had to invite writers for sure. The two of you would be at that dinner table. So thank you again. And
My pleasure.
yeah, and I'm really thrilled to know that my book Remains came out at around the same time that your books did, and I was so like wonderfully surprised to know that our books shared many common themes.
Mm,
At the outset, of course, all of those three books were set in the aftermath of a disaster, Typhoon Haiyan or Typhoon Yolanda. But of course, you know the novels are about so much more than just natural disasters. But can you tell me, Carol and Chris, what was it about the natural disaster that made you decide to include it as an element in your novels, or what is it about events like this that trigger a kind of response from writers and novels like you yourselves?
Maayong aga sa inyong tangatangan. I think Daryl and Chris's novels tackle this issue head on far more than mine does. But yes, I do agree that disasters are a fertile ground for literary conversation and also for ethical thinking and response. And this is maybe because of 3 points that interest me about disasters. One is that natural disasters are never just natural disasters. I think it was the scholar James Warren who argued that they can also be understood as unnatural and man-made disasters because they often involve some kind of interaction between environment and geography on one hand and history, politics, economy, culture, and society on the other hand. So let's just think of how climate change strengthens typhoons, or politicians using relief efforts to court votes or punish their rivals, or how typhoons Yolene, Oyang, Titang, in 1970, and the Super El Nino event in 1982-83, and typhoons
Yeah.
Maring, Nitak, and Undang in 84, which Daryl talks about in her novel, actually helped deepen the political and economic crisis and helped midwife the first quarter storm and growing opposition to the Marcos dictatorship. So that's one point. The second point is that disasters tell us something about inequality because their impact is experienced differently by different people. So for the urban and rural poor, this is disproportionately experienced as devastating loss of lives and loss of livelihoods. And for example, Singapore, where Tiempo Muerto is partly set, is far enough from the equator to make the tropical cyclone a rare occurrence, even though in recent decades it too has experienced flooding. So finally, we are used to thinking of disasters in terms of total number of the dead and missing, in terms of estimated damages and impact on the economy, and in terms of buzzwords like vulnerability and resilience. But for those who bear the brunt of suffering, disasters are intensely personal, familial, and communal. And I wanted to give readers a small sense of this. So, how about you, Chris and Daryl?
Mine was totally different. I didn't think of putting the element of disaster in at the beginning. It was just going to be a novella about a girl that I met in the mountains. And something happened to her because I had accidentally told her father that I had seen her with her boyfriend and she got beaten up for it. And so I felt guilty, really guilty. And I
Yeah.
think I wanted to purge that guilt, you know. So I thought I'd like to write a novella. But when I finished that novella and came back, I was out of the country when I wrote it. But when I came back, the disaster happened. And I went there after Yolanda. I was in Giwan, actually. The first place I went to was in Giwan. And I met a girl there who was talking to some of the boys. We were right in front of the police station that was really like a piece of carcass because it was destroyed by the typhoon. And what really surprised me was that she was flirting with the guys at a time like that. So I said, my novella has to change. So it did. So it became a story of two women. Yeah. After that, I mean, I couldn't not just put in the element of the
That,
disaster, yeah, which was very, very very provoking for me. I mean, of course, being there and seeing the whole thing was shocking enough. So I thought I had to put in that element. Yeah.
yeah. No, that's very interesting. In my case, I really did not want to write anything about the disaster because I grew up there and my family
Yeah.
and my friends there, and we lost family and loved ones. But I was working on a different novel, an entirely different novel, but like, scenes and images kept, I guess, interceding. And then finally, I just decided, okay, I'll do this. But of course, a lot of thinking went into the decision making. Will I tell this story in the first person? I need to distance myself. And my solution was to use like many voices, maybe too many voices, like 12 voices in all. But yes, thank you, Carol and Chris. It's true that oftentimes in the aftermath of a disaster like this, it's easy to forget that these things are happening to people, to individuals, and that's really what I love about your novels, because the political context is very clear. It's very grounded, but also the people are alive, and like you said, Chris, a woman can still be flirting with someone in the aftermath of a disaster. It does not have to erase you in
Yes,
humanity,
exactly.
I
Yeah.
suppose. Yeah. But what about the actual location or the place? I know that in your novel, Carol, it's a fictional place, but it's a very recognizable fictional island. And in your case, also, Chris, you located very
Yeah.
specifically in the
Yeah.
region of Siberia. How did you come upon that decision?
Chris,
Carol, me, Carol.
Chris,
Oh,
no, no,
Either.
think about
Um, well, first, Daryl, I wanted to say if there's anyone who should write about this, Yolanda, and you were there, you're from there, it should really be you. And I'm glad you end up doing it because,
Mhm.
I don't think there's ever been a novel that's really been written by someone who's from there. And experiencing the disaster too, right? I mean, you know what it's like growing up in a place that's always been hit by typhoons and stuff like that. So yeah, it's good that you did it. You changed your mind.
Yes,
Um, anyway, about the location, my novel is set in a place called Bourbon, and it's a real place. It's really
that's
there.
right.
And I didn't change it because I like the name, and I think it's
It's a
because
nice,
yes, it's a nice. It doesn't sound Filipino, right? It's like you're in
right,
some,
exotic. Yes.
Spanish. But I kept it because this is also a place that's very semi-feudal. It's really far from civilization. There's no movie house. There are just a few schools, no banks, nothing. I buy my vegetables on the roadside or at the tabuan, once a week. Um, so I just wanted to use that place because it's like a juxtaposition. The name that sounds very sophisticated and modern, and then you have something that's really very remote and feudal, where all the inequalities are still there. It's so glaring. So I decided to keep it, and also used what I saw in different parts of the province because it's by the coast, and so there are islands off it. So whenever I go to those small islands, I would see scenes that are very, very graphic for me, very pronounced,
Mhm.
and I thought I would use that for the book as well.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, and all I
Interesting.
knew that when I started writing the novel, all I wanted was not to write a novel set in Imperial Manila, as my Mindanao Visayan friends call it.
Yes. Oh,
The
Yes.
main characters in my novel identify as mga Hiligay noon, but the
mm,
fictional island of Banwa, as its name suggests, is a kind of microcosm of our multi-ethnic, multilingual Filipinas. I think
mm,
those who are familiar with the history of Negros know that my island is inspired by the island of Negros, but not being Negrense or Ilongga myself, I didn't think I could do justice to Negros in a way that, for example, Chari Cruz Lucero has done in her excellent work. So, Daryl, I do think that it's important. I mean, for you to have set your novel in, you know,
yeah.
your sort of country or place, because it's a kind of way of bearing witness and testimony. So, when I began plotting and working on the novel years before, I had no idea that someone would build $100,000 a night resort called Banwa private island on Puerto Island, Palawan. So, this is to say that reality is really stranger than fiction.
It really
Same
is.
name too,
It
right?
truly is.
Same spelling. I remember. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Oh. No, but I'm not Ilonggo, but I spent quite a lot of time in Vegas working for them here, and it felt very, very real, and it sounded very authentic. It is authentic, and I guess it's also another point I want to make about you're right. I do agree. Bearing witness, writing about your own town is important, but I think it's also important for a novelist to not be limited by that, by the fact that you're not from that town, therefore you can't write about it. Or these are not my people, therefore I have no right to write about them. I mean, there's such a thing as research after all, and there's such a thing as imagination, and then that's why I was really struck by both your novels, Chris and Carol. How the worlding, as they say, that your novels created. But apart from plays and apart from natural disasters and the devastating effects of those disasters, of course, the books also, like you partly tackled already, Carol, talk about so many other things, and one of the more striking features of both your novels, and I guess my novels, is that they use women's voices, and not just the woman's voice, but voices, and voices coming from different, I guess, social classes, so that while the characters are obviously dealing with their own losses and their own intimate, I guess, devastations, you're also able to bring in so many other issues and so many other themes, and these are themes that I really am also drawn to. Can you tell me, or can you tell our listeners and our viewers what kind of considerations went into your decision to, I guess, create these characters, and to decide that okay, there will be two or three voices, and they will come from these social classes and from these backgrounds.
Carol.
Well, there were several things I wanted to do when I began working on the novel, and first was to write about a haunted house, mainly because I've long been a fan of supernatural fiction, and another was to write about the Kasambahay
Mhm.
experience, and third was to write about the Filipino elite. So I wasn't at all happy with the way Kasambahay were portrayed in Philippine literature. That's why I was really glad to read Chris's novel. Because we don't often
Yeah.
get a sense of the actual work that they do, and worse, many of them are just treated as props or foils or surrogates or avatars or catalysts for middle class angst and soul searching. I was also unhappy with the fact that we tend to compartmentalize our discussion of overseas Filipino workers as if their experiences abroad
Exactly.
were not somehow connected to, in
Yeah.
any way, to their situation in our country. But the
Mhm.
fact is that Southeast Asian middle and upper class families first learn about and practice inequality through their relationships with their kasambahay. So this is not just an issue of class, gender, and race and ethnicity in the abstract, but one of active complicity, our complicity in
Exactly.
the sort of big and small tyrannies exercised in the home, the church, the school, our workplace, the state, and the country. So the novel also gave me the opportunity to explore the history and nature of the Filipino elite in ways that hopefully diverge from the caricatures that my friend, the writer, scholar, activist woman Guillermo, has pointed out still continue to populate the literature of social protest.
Mm,
So telling Russell's story in the first person and Leah's in the third, that actually that's how they speak in my mind, is a way for me to explore and signal a kind of play of intimacy and distance through shifting points of
mm, mm.
voices, social positioning, and politics. Chris?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
okay. Right. Actually, I struggled with the voices. I really did. So you have a character, Luna, who is from the middle class, went to law school, and is there in the province for a holiday, supposedly. And she has this symbiotic relationship with the Kasambahay, who is a survivor of Yolanda. So I didn't know how to distinguish those two voices. I really didn't. So I thought maybe I should you know try to do research on how provincial women, I mean victims of the disaster would talk in the aftermath. So I started going through all the BBC interviews and other TV network interviews, and thought and said, okay, maybe I'll use that kind of a voice. But when I did, my two or three of my friends who read parts of it, the first draft, were really aghast. I mean, they said, "What's this? It's horrible. Why are you putting them down? They sound so horrible." So then I had to rewrite it, and I had to talk to a friend from Tacloban. Just talk to her and said, "How would
mhm,
a young Waray girl think?" But I have to write it in English. So I had to do a lot of consultations with her until I finally
mhm,
came up with what would be acceptable for me and for the other readers.
mhm.
But that was a struggle. It was a struggle. Because it's both in the first person. So, and I wanted the
Yes.
narrative to link and then have loops kasi each one has their own flashbacks, di ba? So,
That's right.
sana
Yeah.
ganun. I wanted that. But,
Mm-mm,
well, I
mm-mm.
don't know. It depends on the readers now what they think of it. But I had to get help from a Waray friend. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that, Chris, about the loops because I have a question later. I'm really interested to talk to both of you about how you structured your novels. But just to respond to what Carol said about stereotypical renderings and portrayals of the Kasambahay and the OFWs, and then I really think that's one of the most important contributions of your novel to the
Yeah.
conversation about not just labor but also with women's voices and agency and I understand, Chris. I mean, even I who grew up in Tacloban and in various parts of the Visayas, actually, because we were always moving. It was very difficult to make the characters ring true and to be to give them that kind of fidelity. In my case, I guess it was a little bit easier, not just because I speak the language, but I come from obviously a very different social class and background from the other major character in the novel, but it was also something that I really wanted to challenge myself with,
Yeah.
and also because it's something that's always interested me. When you grow up in the province and you have a house that's bigger than other people's houses, or a house that has more rooms, you will end up hosting all kinds of people, and we were always surrounded by different kinds of people, and some of them are our family. They're first cousins, like really close, but the gap can be so wide, and
Yeah.
yet you can form like really meaningful and really deep friendships with people. And when you're growing up in your innocence, the social classes don't really matter, and that was the one of the things that I wanted to explore in the novel. When she comes back and she tries to revive that friendship, and she's so naive, but it slowly dawns on her how different and how distant their lives have become.
Yeah.
So yeah, I really understand your the
Yeah.
challenges that Carol, pass a few pages in your book, and it's in Russell's voice that's so poetic.
Mm.
Like the tone just changes, and it surprises me, when she talks about uh, the migrant workers here in Singapore. It's
Yeah.
sort of a first person point of view, and then Chris, I really love the parts that are so body and like I really think you were able to approximate that kind of humor that Bisaya women have, and the way they treat their bodies, and I just wanted to bring that up.
Yeah.
But
Yeah,
yeah,
I
so
just wanted to
you were
I just wanted to add that, for example, I think in Daryl's novel, it's quite important that she provides the kind of transcripts in Waray of, a series of people from different social classes talking about the experience. So there's one incredible one about a child and his friends surfing, so to speak.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
also enjoyed the way Chris had the
Mhm.
courage to use the kind of language to talk about the kasambahay in a way that really treads a kind of
Yeah.
beautiful line in being able to convey the earthy language of Binisaya and
Mm.
talking it in English.
Exactly.
So I just wanted to say I enjoyed
Yeah.
voices.
But
Yeah. Oh my
what
gosh,
struck
there's
me,
so much to talk about. Yeah.
but
Sorry, Chris,
for
go
me,
ahead.
what struck me about your novel is that there are three levels of recovering that you talked about in your book. I can't remember now the exact words in Warai, but you were talking about three stages, and I thought that was what set it. That's what set the novel, to see how people recover from it. What does it mean to them? What does it mean for the Warai?
Mhm.
In Carol's book, I mean, just the story of a woman who had to work in Singapore and sees a childhood friend, who is there and who's very wealthy. I mean, the disparate lives is just really so evident. So those are the two things that really struck me, about the books. Well, Daryl's and Carol's.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I wish we had more time because there's so much to talk about. For example, the use of language, and how it's the three novels are in English, but how the same language can be used by different voices. And but sorry, I didn't prepare. There are other questions that I wanted to ask you. Okay, so Chris, earlier you started talking about how you just you ended up sort of weaving the
Mm,
stories and the recollections of the two women, but also the other characters in your novel who are also very interesting. And Carol, you also started talking about how you decided that one will speak in the first person point of view, and the other character's story will be told in the third person, because that's how they sounded in your head. How did you arrive at those decisions, and what do you think did that decision add to your novel, or to the message, or to the themes that you wanted to explore?
Carol,
Ang
first.
hirap naman ng question. I'm not even sure I can explain it, but this was just how it worked out for me. So if I were asked to explain it, I wouldn't. So I suppose it's really up to the reader to decide whether that strategy worked or not. But I guess
Mm,
my sense was that somehow Russell was closer to me, or I felt closer to her
Ah,
than I did to Leah, who kind of, comes from one of those Forbes Park type that I've
oh.
only ever encountered, by walking in Forbes Park rather than actually riding in a car. So
With them.
the kind of experience I had of going to these exclusive villages is quite
Mm-mm.
similar in some ways to what Russell was going through when she
Yeah.
went to the fictional Lavizares village.
Oo. Yeah.
Uh,
Oo.
uh,
Very, very clear. Though that scene was so clear. It's so evident.
I
Yeah. But
know.
It's like being in a foreign country.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Chris, Daryl?
Oh,
Yeah,
I
Chris.
well, I was talking about the loop, and it's all like first person for both of the characters. But I
Yes,
think
right. Yeah.
important for me to do the loop is because they were all looking back at their lives, like so you have one character thinking about her mother, and there's a subplot because there's a woman mayor, a lady mayor, who reminds her of her mother, and then
Yeah.
you also have
Mm-mm.
the Waray
Mm-mm.
girl thinking about her lost love. That's how she got pregnant. So I think I had to do that loop, and I don't know if I did it right, but I felt that that was the only way I could do it. Mm.
No, it again. I'm really interested in these conversations about because they are in my case at least because in my novel, although there is one main narrator, but there are voices that sort of like interject, and it's also true in my case that it's important to that I was able to capture the way they sounded
Mm.
to me, and the sound is very important. But listening to you, Carol and Chris, it also makes me think that um, it's of course we have our biases and we have and but it's remarkable. For example, Carol, that although you say that you're closer to the Russell character, the lead character, but her character is also, I think, very fairly and justly uh, rendered, and it's difficult, right, when you're trying to make multiple characters come alive in a really finite timeline. So I really admire that about your novels,
I
Chris.
think I got a lot of help because I had a lot of opportunities to hang out with Singaporean OFWs. So,
Mm.
in fact, a lot of their
Mm-mm,
stories
mm-mm,
I got their permission to use here, but they didn't want to be attributed because many of them are still working in Singapore.
Mm.
They haven't retired yet.
um,
But it helped to talk to them and get their sense of what they were going through and to see how they kind of live their lives and what kind of thoughts and aspirations they had. So I'm very grateful to
mm-mm,
my friends in Singapore for sort of helping me find a way to tell their stories.
mm-mm.
Mm. Yeah, I think actually that's how we get. I, I mean, when Carol talking about that, it's actually how we were able to write the book by talking to people there.
Mm-mm,
And it's the
mm-mm.
same thing when I go to the market or when I stop a woman selling donuts and malunggay. I sit down and chat with them, and I think that's when you get a sense of what life really is like for them there, rather than just
Exactly. Yeah.
staying in one place and blocking yourself off from the community. And
Yeah.
I mean, even though, like, Carol was born and raised in Manila, and me too in some ways, in Quezon City. So, but sometimes I feel like I'm a foreigner when I'm there, because I see things that are different from what
Yes.
I would think
Mm-mm,
being
mm-mm,
in Manila, being here in the city, in the capital. So I think that's very helpful, having people like them sharing their lives to us, and that's precious too, very
mm-mm.
precious. You know.
Yeah. And I
Yeah.
and I think it's really it's a privilege. I mean, in my case, that's how I see it because I'm a researcher. I work for an NGO, and I guess both of you also do other kinds of writing, which I will talk to you about
Yeah.
later. But being given that opportunity to really talk to people, and to really immerse yourself in their lives, that's something that not all writers uh, get to do, and so I really see that as a privilege, but also responsibility, I suppose, to make the characters, as I keep saying, come alive, and to really uh, give them the fidelity
Mm.
that they deserve.
Yeah.
Uh,
Well.
Is it
I
okay
mean,
if we talk some more? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
no, no,
Sorry,
no, no, no.
Chris.
It's okay. No, I was just thinking about, like life there in the province, because I was told, there was one part of the book where the girl rides on a motorcycle, and she
I
becomes
love
friendly with
that.
the driver. But someone says,
Yeah,
how can you have that intimacy right away? I said, it's like that in the province.
it's true.
It
Yeah,
really is like
exactly.
that. So these are things
Mm-hmm.
that we don't see here, but it's there. It's really, in a
Mm-hmm.
way, I hate saying this, but it's a different life. You know?
It is, and
Yeah.
and we know why life there is is different, and and we sort of started talking about that, the political, economic, and even the natural setting. I think really influences the way people view themselves and their bodies, even.
Mm.
Yeah, so. But I also like that in your novels you didn't have to explain that this is how it is in the province, and then that was really um, very refreshing and a relief for me, who is a provinciana, and it's I really love seeing that kind of a treatment in your novels. Is it okay if we talk a little bit more about form and yeah? So sorry, just a little bit more technical about how novels are structured, and the kind of decision making that goes into that, where exactly the novel starts, because I mean in conversations with different writers, I guess it's different for different writers, right? Some start with an image, or some start with, like, to them, in my case, the ending was so clear, and I just had to go back and look for where it started. But in my experience, and because this is my first novel, form was so important. But I realized that in hindsight, and it was so liberating once I arrived, or once I landed on a structure. And it kind of, as I always say, that the structure actually, like, set me free, and I became more comfortable in the storytelling. But what about for you, in your experience, Chris and Carol? Because both your novels are also not like typical linear novels, like beginning, middle, end, and there are at least two stories that are happening at the same time, or one after the other. How did you arrive at that structure, and what do you think are the risks, or what are the some of the, like, limitations that you just had to deal with when in deciding on that structure?
Chris?
You first. Kasi ang mag-read ng libro mo eh.
Well, I'm kind of a
Complex
big
din yung structure ng book
malinis,
mo, Chris.
No, the structure of Carol's book is so seamless. It's just,
So seamless, yeah.
yeah. So,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
well, basically, I
Yeah.
stole a lot from the Gothic novel as a genre. So I'm a
mm,
fan of Gothic novels. So I wanted to do my own tropical Gothic version, as Nick Hawkin would put it. So I
yeah.
kind of played with the conventions of what literary critics call the female Gothic, to use Ellen Moore's
Ah,
term. And
Mm,
these
yes.
conventions include, for example, traveling heroines in search of lost or absent mothers, exploration of female fears and anxieties about
Mm-hmm.
entrapment in their own homes and bodies, and violence, sexual, domestic, and political. And above all, the female Gothic's critique of the values and ideologies of patriarchy and capitalism. So I'm
mm,
interested in the concept of inheritance. So how what we inherit from our literal and metaphorical mothers in terms of not only genes, history, and memory, but also storytelling, placemaking, activist, intellectual, and other capacities. So I see the Gothic form as a kind of vehicle of social protest, one that can be in productive dialogue with our country's long tradition of engaged literature. So,
mm.
Chris Carroll, how about you?
I actually had no idea what I was doing when I was writing it. I just wanted each other to pick up the pieces from where they left off. So
Mm-hmm.
in a sense, that's how
Exactly.
it is in the aftermath of a disaster. Like, how do you pick up your life again? So parang I just wanted it to be that way. One woman telling her story, and the next one just picking up from where the other left off, and then on and on. So I
Mm-hmm.
I I just ended up doing that.
But I think that's a very nice organizing trope, the kind of picking up
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
both metaphor and
Uh-oh.
also going to organize the story. So I like it.
I think
Mhm.
partly there are two things that I was thinking of after that, after having written it. I think one is that my journalistic writing comes in, there has to be a flow. And secondly, when you talk to people, to women especially, I mean, when I talk to the Kasambahais and other women in the village, they kind of talk like that too, one starts talking and the other continues, and then the next one, and then it goes back again to the first person who talked. So I thought, why don't I just do it like that, and
I
in the absence of knowing what the
Exactly.
form should
Yeah.
be.
I
Yun
think
lang.
Yeah.
friends
Yeah.
friends
Yeah.
talk like that too, right? Picking up
Then people who talk like that.
even
Oo.
years
But
apart.
yeah, now that you now that you mentioned it, Chris, one other thing that I wanted to bring up about your novel is it's the orality, of the narrative. It sounded very like oral. You know how in especially in Eastern Visayas, the susumaton.
Yeah,
That's how we tell
yeah,
stories, and
yeah.
the oral tradition. So that I really love that
Yes,
part about your book, and I kind of tried to um, do that in my novel. That's why I wanted all of the characters who speak
all
in
the
the
voices.
first person. Yeah. It's kind of it was kind of a mess, but it was also like fun to do. And I guess if I didn't have fun, I wouldn't have been able to finish that novel. And Carol, I just want to mention this is kind of non sequitur, but since you started talking about the gothic and the uncanny, I just wanted to let you know that book, your books and your essays were very helpful to me in
Mm,
my master's thesis about fantasy and uncanny. So yeah,
yeah.
and I
Um,
guess that
no,
and
magandang
and we were like,
story, di ba? May ghost story si Carol sa novel.
yeah,
It's like, oh yes,
yes, and
completely
and
forgot.
I love that it wasn't resolved,
I know.
right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So parang,
Actually, from the very start of the novel, parang it was already there. So I was waiting for the ghost to be mentioned actually because it already had that kind of eeriness, right, from the start. So yeah, it's good to
mm,
hear that what the sources and influences are of that novel treatment. But so I forgot also to I guess I should have brought this up earlier, but the role of history or your notions of history and how that influenced your novel writing. Was it a big part? Were you conscious about it, about making sure that the novels are grounded in their historical place, I suppose.
Well, I once heard Resil Mohares give a talk, and actually we then interviewed him for his festschrift in Ateneo, which came out as a special issue in Philippine Studies. And one of the questions we asked him was like, "What do you think about contemporary literature?" And he made this very controversial statement. And he says most of it is historically shallow. So, natamaan ako, sabi ko, naku, so in other words, if we're gonna write a novel, we really have to know our history. So, I think because Brazil is a cultural historian, he has a very deep sense of and has done really extensive research. Right? So, I think his impression was that some of our Filipino writing suffers from this shallowness. I mean, probably it has to do with the sense of place as well, and whether people do know the history or not. So, it's possible to live in the Philippines and know nothing about it, as some of our upper class Filipinos, suffer from.
Yeah.
So I think
Yeah.
history was important, and we needed to do a lot of research on this because I needed to understand what's going on. So I think maybe my background as an academic helped because it did give me the kind of resources to do the kind of research. But I think, for example, Chris's background as a journalist also gives her,
Yeah.
and Daryl's background as NGO worker also, so I think all three of us do research and what people like to call field work, but that's very problematic as a term. um, but I think we do this as part of our job, so it
Yeah.
actually prepares us to sort of delve deeper rather than just depend on surface impressions, which is what some writers do.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Going back to Brazil, because when I would go to Cebu, I would always see him. I would always meet up with him. Like we would have like really one of our very, you know how Brazil is. We would have long, long lunches, and he would talk to me about the Battle of Mactan. And I was like, oh my God, we got
wow.
it so wrong, you know? And I wanted to put that in a way because you're in the Visayas, that's where, you know, Magellan went and there was this battle. And I said, no, I cannot put in that kind of history that we knew or that we were taught for all, you know, for all these years. So I kind of like made fun a little bit of that history, that part of our history, you know, what happened during the battle and that we don't
Yeah.
even know what Lapu-Lapu looks like, and yet we
Yes.
have statues of him looking like, you know, the macho man. Um, so things like that was really important. And
Hmm.
plus with the disaster, you realize that our history is basically about destruction. You know, it's not just
Yeah.
it's not just natural disaster, but it's also man-made. We've also destroyed our own country. So I, in a
Hmm.
way, kind of
Hmm.
wanted to put that in. Mm, politically. We destroyed.
I'm seeing.
Yeah.
Anything
Sorry.
against you. I'm seeing comments coming in, so I'd like to
Okay.
invite the viewers. Please feel free to write your questions, and we'll spend some time to take them up. But before we take up your questions, I wanted to ask you both, Carol and Chris, um, about the thin line between exploring the truths or shining a light on underlying issues of inequality and that of exploiting the spectacle of loss and death and disasters and creating poverty porn, or the thin line between representation and appropriation. Were these did you at all think about these things? Were you concerned about them, and how did you deal with them in your novels?
Well, I think this is an issue that most Filipino writers who, I mean, after all, most of us are urban middle class writers, so we grapple with
Mhm,
this, right?
mhm,
Obviously, we don't want to have political tourism or dark tourism or poverty porn or disaster porn, let alone what Raymond Williams calls the false commitment of the inserted political
exactly.
reference, which is kind of a pet peeve of mine every time I read Philippine literature. I say, this is really kind of false. It rings false
Yeah.
when the writer
Really?
is
Yeah.
like, oh, now I need to talk about Philippine politics and stuff, so I'll just insert it, and then that's the last we'll hear about it. So it's not seamlessly integrated, and so it just reads false. So if writers choose to venture beyond their comfort zones, and I think Daryl already said this, that we should, the issue is whether we can do justice to the people we write about, whose life worlds and maybe even worldviews we may not necessarily share. But ultimately, I think Chris said this, it's not really the authors, but the readers who can decide whether
Good job.
our novels work or not.
Mm, yeah.
Chris, Daryl?
You want to
Yeah.
add to that, Chris?
Um, no, to me it was really more like I didn't want to stick to stereotypes like, you know, women in the province are saintly and hardworking and all that. I think I wanted to get away from that. They can also be cruel and vindictive, you know? And the same thing with men, not you have the uncle, you know, the man of the house who you might think might be very brutal and things like that, but he's not, you know. So like, I didn't want to get into what men should be, what women should be in this kind of setting. Um, their environment, in a way, makes them who they are.
It's a tough thing to grapple with, and also because we all three of us came
Mm,
from academic background,
yeah.
and I know that my training in comparative literature made me very, very critical about social classes and how history is are rendered in novels, and so I was admittedly very kind of conscious about that, but also I had to make a decision to also apply my journalism training, and just tell things as they are or as they appeared to the different voices that I included in the novel. And then, like you said, Chris, I mean, we do have our own moral compasses, but ultimately the readers will have to will have to judge. Yeah, if we did the places and the stories and the people justice. Okay, I'd like to read a few questions that came in, and thank you again, friends, viewers. I'm sure half of them are our family members and our friends who are watching us today. But there's one here from Miss Concepcion Lagos. She says, "I have yet to read your novels, but may I ask what unique perspective would you think you may have given to the male voices in your stories? You've talked about how you fleshed out the female voices, but how about the male stories?" And she says, "Thank you for this excellent and elegant conversation." What? How do you respond to that, Carol? Yeah,
Chris?
the male
Ah,
characters.
the male. Uh, well, there's always a dichotomy. Like you have, for example, two brothers, and one is supposed to be the smart one, and yet he falls for a woman who's very vain and loves her, for the rest of his life and dies because of it. So, and then you have another man who's like street smart, became wealthy, became like the de facto mayor of the town, and yet he would also do something
Yeah.
as horrible as I don't even know if I should say this, as sleeping with a
Go
kasambahay.
ahead.
So, that close enough to being called a rape, but the
Yeah.
woman didn't see it as that. So it's not a black and white thing, really. I think the men deal with their demons as much as women do. I think we just don't talk about it as much as we see the men, having to face their um, their sins.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Indeed. Mhm.
Well, I had a lot of fun fleshing out the character of the, kind of villain of the story. And his name is Rigoberto Agalon.
Yes.
And actually, the interesting thing is you can create him out of a composite of many of our politicians and men, men of ama ng tahanan, right? But what's interesting is that a lot of the stories I tell about the Filipino elites, many of them are actually historically documented, so I didn't really have to make up a lot. For example, if you want to think about how people could use their hacienda and have orgies, that actually happened, but it didn't happen in the Visayas. It actually happened in Luzon.
Mm.
So, I think people who know the history of the Filipino elites can recognize some of the characters that I kind of mentioned. But it's nice to create a kind of wicked man, but at the same time, in Leah's relationship with him, we see that it's
Yeah.
quite moving. She can also see that he was an alcoholic. So it probably tried to give a kind of more well-rounded picture of the sort of what we like to see as villains, in our national story.
Exactly.
But I have to say that I don't give too much emphasis on men in this novel. Maybe in the next one I will.
We'd like to see that, Carol. We'd like to see that.
Yeah,
But yeah,
a novel with women, because we're so used to reading all these novels with male characters, and yeah, this time I want women.
Yeah. It's
no,
yeah. The other writers can do the male characters.
the novel kasi of Carol has all these political tidbits, di ba? Parang,
I
who's
know political chismes.
Oh, all are not documented. They come from the archives.
Oh
So
God.
one of my friends, one of
interesting,
the
di ba?
documents, and it's really
I
horrible.
really love
Yeah, they're 62-year-old men married to women out of their teens, or one of our
it.
greatest statesmen, Filipino statesmen, is a serial adulterer, and gimme, gimme, gimme pala, lahat Mr. 10%.
Oo.
So it's this is really based on gossip and of course rumor mongering, but also documented facts about some of our
Documented. Yeah.
politicians.
Okay, I
Thank you
think
for that question.
Yeah.
Well, in my novel, the male characters were very important because I guess one of the themes that I wanted to explore there is because she ended up being raised by men and by an absent mother. Uh, and she also had to reconcile the truths about these men that that who raised her, and it was a struggle, but it was also fun to do. It was challenging because I like writing about people who are different from me, and that made it fun for me.
I was
Can we take a go ahead, Chris?
I was actually bitten about one part of your novel about the friend of the father and the mother.
Yeah, the missing
And
person.
that's- yes,
Mhm.
I
entering
like
the
I like
purpose.
the tiger. I like the tiger.
Yeah.
He seems to symbolize that kind of male power, and so
Yeah, the
really
beast, the
like
beastliness.
yeah, in the
The
basement, tiger
beasts
in the
in
basement.
the basement. Yeah.
But I also like
Um,
Chris's, the depiction of the sort of the patriarch himself, with whom the two main women characters have very fraught relationships. So I thought that was
oh,
well done too for Chris. Yeah.
Mm.
can we take
Okay.
up one more question? So I think we have 6 minutes left to this conversation. I'd like to read one more question from the viewers. Okay. Oh, this one is from Noel. Thanks, Noel. She says, "How long did each of you take to write your respective novels, and who did or do you envision as your readership for these novels? Did you think of a readership, or were you
Chris?
conscious of a readership before
No,
writing
I do not.
your novel?"
Well, actually, the
Fast.
actual writing of the novel itself, the first draft was completed in just 3 months. But the problem was that it took me such a long time to find the time and the courage to start working on the novel. So that one took decades, but the actual writing process was pretty fast, and then followed by a longer period of revisions. So I think,
Editing and revision.
yeah, Chris.
Well, mine was a
So,
novella
Chris.
first. It was a novella first, which I finished in a couple of months, 3 months, and then I turned it into a novel, so which took another 5, 6, 7 months maybe. But after that, there was a series of rewriting. So all in all, it's probably like 5 years. I mean, you don't when you finish
Yeah,
it, you don't want to look at it again. You leave it there,
it's true.
you give it to someone, and then let that person take their time, his or her time reading it, and then talk to that person again and see how you can edit it, and then it's not perfect again and you send it back. So it's a process, I think. Yeah.
Daryl,
Yeah,
how about you?
yeah. In my case, because I didn't realize that that I sort of had the materials already for this novel. Because as I said earlier, I was writing a totally different novel. That's something that I had been working on for maybe more than 10 years already. But when I decided on this one, the writing process was very fast, like 2 months, and
Yeah.
I used materials. But I was able to use materials I had written like 6 years ago, right after Yolanda, because I was writing. I wrote a couple of pieces for some publications, and I was doing research, and I was able to use those. So. And some of those materials came from like 7, 6 years ago, but the actual piecing together happened in 2 months. And like you, the revision and the editing and the doubts and the fear. And once it was finally accepted for publication, I pulled it out. I said, no, I don't think that I'm ready. Can I take it back? And then, that. So all in all, it takes about 6, 7 years, not to something like
I
this.
think Noel, this is Noel De Jesus who asked the question. She's also working on
Yes.
a novel, so Karina's been raving about it, so we look forward to that. But going back to the question of
Wow.
readership or audience, I think in my
Yeah.
case, it was very clear to me that my audience was Filipino and should be
Yeah.
Filipino. So I didn't really make any concessions to make the novel readable for a non-Filipino audience because to me, my audience was Filipino. I didn't care
Yeah.
too much about what they call the world literature because there are some people who say that one of the sort of things you sacrifice when you try to write literature intended for a larger audience is that sometimes you have stint on explaining the local terms or
Mm.
maybe on using language. But I think Chris's
Mm.
experience was different. I think in one of our conversations, Chris says that she doesn't write for a very specific audience, but she's very skilled at being able to sort of calibrate the novel so that it can be read by non-Filipinos, but also, Filipinos can find joy in that. So
Yeah.
I think Chris is different, her experience.
Well, I think I just don't sit and say, okay, I'm writing this for a specific person or a specific group. I think more than
Yeah.
anything, okay, this is going to sound a little selfish. More than anything, I'm writing it for myself. uh, but I think with things like, do I want a foreigner to understand it? I think to me, my journalistic background just sets in. The need for a little bit of background, not everything, but just a little bit of that. But I don't sit down and say this has to go out in the world. No,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's yeah. I think once you finish a book, it takes a life of its own.
It
So
does.
where it goes, that's where it's meant to be.
Yeah, I think my take on it is it's not so much because I have a hard time thinking of readership in the commercial sense. I think of it from an ethical and a from an ethical point of view. Like when I write something, of course I want to make it fun for myself. I'm also writing for myself, but I also want whoever is reading to take the trouble to understand this world that I'm writing about. So
Yeah.
I will freely use the local language or the kind of English that Filipinos or these characters in the novel will use, and I think that responsible and mature readers, no matter where they are in the world, will if they
Make an
like it, they
effort,
will take the trouble
right?
to
Yeah, should know.
understand it. It's right.
We had that
Yeah.
discussion with Carol, like why do we always have to translate every single Tagalog word or every local language, into English? It doesn't have to be that way because
Yeah.
it loses the meaning, right? For every
Right.
single word and phrase
Yeah.
that we translate. Yeah.
I would do it if the sometimes I would do it only if the effect is humorous. When there's a humorous potential to it, I would do it, but otherwise I won't bother. Um, wow, it's 11 o'clock. Are we allowed to extend by a few minutes? Because there's one question from Julian De La Serna that I really want to read, and I want to because I'm curious to hear from Chris and Karen.
5 minute
Um,
extension.
5 minute extension. Okay. Julian says, given the history and politics of language in post-colonial Philippines, we actually were talking about this already. What do you think are the ethical decisions of writing in English entail, even if you're writing specifically for Filipino readers? Yeah.
Well, I
Wow, we
think
can write. I can write a thesis on this, Julian. Thank you for asking this question.
galing yan si Julian eh. Editor ko yan eh. Sa fiction
What do
studies.
you think, Chris? How would you
I
respond
think,
to this question?
yeah, I mean, first of all, I mean, for me, English was not my first language. I mean, from what I understand, I grew up speaking a combination of Cebuano, Filipino, and Hokkien. I only learned English in school, but that happens to be the language that maybe because of my neo-colonial education, that's the language I choose to write in. So I'm very much aware of the sort of ethical implications, particularly because
Yeah.
English remains the language of our middle and upper classes, and the sort of access to language actually tells you a little bit about the kind of inequalities of power and hierarchies.
Mm.
So I've had situations when I've heard people switch to English when they're talking to people not of their classes, and
Yeah.
that becomes a way to separate, to distance yourself, and to also assert your superiority or hierarchy,
Yeah.
right? And that really bugged me. At the same time, if I were to speak in my mother tongue, what is my mother tongue? It would be a halo-halo of Hokkien and Cebuano and Filipino, right? So unsa mani.
Yeah. Yeah.
If I were to write in it, who would read?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah. Yeah.
so, Chris,
Um,
what are
I
your
had
thoughts on language?
Yeah, I had a little bit of a crisis on that too. It's like I'm writing in English, but is it really my language? And so I had to read like past essays of my grandfather, who was a professor in Dean, and it kind of made me feel okay, it's okay to write in English. But that's because I grew up in the South and the language there is Chabacano. So how am I going to
Mm,
write
mm,
Chabacano? And my Tagalog was not any good either. And I really envy my colleagues who can write in Tagalog. I can't do that because I grew up in Zamboanga. Tagalog was I even failed Filipino in my when I was in grade one.
Okay.
Because my teacher was
Same here.
my teacher was Bisaya, so I wasn't understanding what she was saying. And kaya, I mean, will I write in Chabacano? Even is Chabacano? It was at that time I was even questioning myself if Chabacano was a language. But now
Hmm.
they're going back to it. They're reviving
Hmm.
it. It's hard. I mean, we went to school, it's English. You go to university, it's English. You go to work, and it's in English.
Hmm.
So it's
Right.
whether or not I like it, it's the language. It's the only language I can write in. So
Same here.
yeah.
Yeah, I think my perspective on this has always been that, at the very least, you should be aware of the ethical implications of whatever language you're using. And I also, as a writer, well, for this novel in particular, I've always thought of it as a novel in Waray, written in English. And I treat English, the language, as just a tool that I need in order to tell a story. And because it's a tool that I've chosen to work with, it's my responsibility also to use it in the best way, the most effective way possible. So yeah, that's why it's also important to me, the English language, because like you, Chris, it's just the only language that I can write long long pieces in, sadly. But yeah, but I've also written in what I some poems and some short stories.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
That's
Okay, Padma says significant portions of the novel are in what I without translation, and she says it does so many interesting things. Yeah, and thank you, Padma, and that was deliberate also to include straight passages in what I. Wow, so it's 11:05.
last
Thank
question.
you so much. One
May,
one
may
more
I ask you-
question. Okay. So from Dessa. Hello, Po. I'm just curious. How necessary is gender in the conversation of aesthetics and disaster politics?
Well,
How necessary is it?
I think, again, disasters are experienced, personally, individually, familially, and also communally. So I think, for example, one of the most haunting stories from one of our, super typhoons is, a village of men dying, right? I mean, being killed because they had to defend their houses for fear of looting, right? And then you also have stories, I think, of Imelda Marcos being so shocked because during one of the disasters, and she was out there distributing Nutribun, and there was a woman who came up to her and tried to show her her baby, and the baby was dead. So I think gender does have a bearing on how people actually behave in moments of disaster and how they respond to the aftermath.
Mhm. Chris, did you want to
No,
add anything to
I have not thought of it, so I don't really have an answer to that. I think
that?
it should just be natural. I mean, we all play a role in what happens to our country. So I think for me that's part of it. Yeah.
Sarah?
Right. I mean, I echo what Carol said earlier when we started the conversation about how different people, different social classes, different genders experience disasters differently, and it does have a bearing on one's gender. I remember in the aftermath of Typhoon Yolanda, one of the most difficult products to procure were sanitary napkins. And one of the biggest problems of women were, toilets, secure and safe toilets. So, and that's not necessarily a problem for men. So, very, very practical and very real things like that. All right, so we really are. I wish we could just go on and on and on. Thank you so much, Carol
Thank you
and
very much.
Chris. Thank you,
Thank you.
viewers.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ateneo Press, for
Thank you.
organizing this. And please, to everyone who sent in their questions and comments, thank you. You enriched our conversation. There are more talks. organized by the Ateneo University Press during this book fair. And please also don't forget to check out our books on Manila. Yeah, ManilaBookFair.com, and please check out the social media pages of the Ateneo University Press on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. I think we need to close this conversation, but it's been really, really such a delight for me personally. Thank you, Carol and Chris, and then thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you,
Have a good
Daryl.
day.
Pleasure talking to you both.
Yes. Yeah. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.